Hi everyone, my name is Selvin and welcome to Selvin Student 101. In today's video, I'm going to give you my honest opinion on the final year of Cambridge undergraduate economics. Along the way, I'll outline what you learn, how good the teaching was, and how much work there was. My final year was particularly unique because it was the first year where the university has ever had to implement some sort of alternative arrangements because of COVID. So I'll outline how that affected my year. Let's get into the video. In third year, you have to do 2 compulsory modules, 2 optional modules, and a 7,500 word dissertation on a topic of your choice, which is usually handed in April. I'll make a separate video on the dissertation because that was a massive experience in itself. The 2 compulsory modules are microeconomics and macroeconomics. My 2 optional papers were advanced econometrics and banking and finance. The other available optional modules can be found up here. I found that third year definitely had the least amount of contact hours. There are only about 8 to 9 lectures a week and there were 4 supervisions per paper per term. If you're unsure of what a supervision is, I give a detailed explanation in my first year video up here. Essentially, you get given an assignment to do beforehand, then you meet in groups of about 3 to 8 and you go over this assignment with a supervisor. They can be pretty intense, especially when the groups are small, because you end up getting asked loads of questions. However, I do think it's an excellent way to learn. Anyway, on to the paper overviews. First, I'll talk about the microeconomics paper. In third year, this is split into 4 sections and you do 2 sections per term. The first section of microeconomics is on second best theory. You look at how to optimally implement government policy in a second best world. A second best world is a world in which the government is faced with some sort of constraints and they have to take these constraints as given. This is a much more realistic scenario in comparison to a lot of the economic models that you do when you first learn economics. You first recap the Pareto conditions and the welfare theorems, and you also define what a first best and second best world actually are. You then learn about who bears the cost of a tax and how this depends on the elasticity of supply and demand. Following this, you look at deadweight loss and the general theory of second best. Then to finish off this section, you look at production efficiency, the Diamond-Murley's result, and Ramsey taxes. Overall, I really didn't like this section's content because it was often so difficult to understand what the question actually wanted you to say. The concepts were lectured relatively well, but I think they just weren't mathematically rigorous enough for me to actually understand them properly. The second section of microeconomics is on policy evaluation. In this section, you use econometric techniques to analyse how effective policies actually are. You spend the first 4 lectures recapping some basic econometrics about how a cross-sectional regression actually works and how to reduce unbiasedness. You also look at how some research papers use the cross-sectional regression and how they try to reduce unbiasedness in their regressions. You then look at how to reduce unbiasedness in a panel data regression along with papers which try to do this. Overall, I did think that the content of this section was quite interesting, but it was just recapping something we already knew how to do in a slightly different way. The lecturer was also very difficult to understand and to listen to. So far, I really did not like micro very much. The third section of micro, which is actually the first section of the second term, focuses on contracts, health, and education. This section essentially recovers a lot of the stuff learned in the second term of micro in second year. You first review the principal agent model again. You then look at how to incentivize efficiencies in monopolies, which to be fair was a slightly new topic. You then look at the same adverse selection model as in second year. There are some new models in relation to healthcare, and these are tied in with some research papers. These models essentially try to determine how much healthcare an individual would consume with and without insurance. Lastly, the education section recovers the signalling model from second year. There is also a lecture that argues whether education increases your human capital or is purely just a signal. Overall, this was my favourite section in third year macro, but that really isn't saying a lot because I thought the whole thing was pretty bad. The models in this section were definitely explained a lot better than in second term of second year, but the lecturer, who is the same as policy evaluation, still was quite unclear and difficult to follow. He often skipped over the more unclear difficult steps in order to focus on the more basic, simpler steps. Lastly, the final section of microeconomics was on social cost benefit analysis. The lecture was the same as first term micro, second best theory. You first learn about what social cost benefit analysis actually is and what shadow prices are. You then expand the analysis to take into account equity concerns. You then actually look at how governments use social cost benefit analysis when they implement a policy, and you look at HS2 as an example. To finish off this section, you look at how economists would analyse global warming from a social cost benefit analysis perspective, and why in the short term, the consequences of global warming are often neglected. Overall, I thought that third year micro was pretty awful in comparison to the great micro in the first 2 years. The lectures themselves were often very difficult to understand, difficult to follow, and difficult to stay engaged with. The concepts in them were often not very rigorous, and a lot of it was just a recap of what we had already done. I was definitely hoping that macro would be a lot better, and it definitely was. Macro followed a similar structure to micro, where you have 4 sections and you do 2 sections per paper per term. The first section of macro is on economic growth. You first start by redefining what economic growth actually is and the variety of ways you can actually measure it. You then revisit the solo growth model and look at how it performs versus empirical data. You then incorporate human capital into the solo growth model, and then you can look at how that affects the mathematical dynamics. You also now take productivity growth as endogenous within the model. So you can look at how things like technological change actually affect the solo growth model's dynamics. To finish off the term, you look at how limits on natural resources affect the solo growth model. Overall, I thought that the content was quite interesting, and I was happy with the amount of maths in this section of the course. However, the lecturer was often a bit difficult to follow and was sometimes not very clear and difficult to understand. The topic as a whole is quite interesting, however, and the extensions to the solo growth model made it a lot more tangible to me. The second section of first term was on macroeconomic policy. This was quite similar to second year's second term macro, and the lecturer was the same. I was really happy about this because I thought that the lecturer was amazing and she was really good at explaining stuff, and her content was often very good. First, you briefly recover optimal monetary policy in the baseline model learned in second year. Using this, you derive the trade-off between variance in output and inflation. You then look at policy making under uncertainty, where a multiplicative or additive parameter is not actually known. Following this, you look at the modern day challenges currently being faced in terms of monetary policy. The rest of this section then focuses on fiscal policy. You first look at why taxes are smoothed over time instead of taxing a lot in one period and then none in the second period. You then look at how government debt evolves over time and the conditions under which it will become unstable. You then look at how different political approaches can actually create an economic cycle. To finish off the term, you look at modern day fiscal policy rules and frameworks. Overall, I really enjoyed learning this content because it was essentially an expansion on content that I already knew I liked and understood fairly well. This was actually my favourite section in the whole of third year, but that's not necessarily saying a lot because a lot of the third year teaching really was not great. Now, the first section of the second term focuses on real business cycles. This section looks at why the economy varies in the short run. You first look at some empirical data on how economic variables have moved together in the past. You then revisit the labour-leisure choice model and the intertemporal choice model. These are then essentially used as building blocks to derive the baseline real business cycle model. Following this, you then look at how to actually solve this model because it's not really possible unless you put some certain assumptions on it. Because the demand side and policy are actually left out of the model, you then look at how to implement these in the model. You also show how this means that prices now have an effect. To finish off the term, you then derive the new Keynesian Phillips curve and are presented a monetary policy and inflation model alongside it. Overall, I thought that this content was quite interesting, but it was definitely quite conceptually tough to understand. The questions were quite manageable as you could kind of just work through the maths and get an answer. The lecture was decent and fairly engaging. And now, to finish off macro, this section looks at the international financial system. You first look at how the financial system has essentially widened current account deficits over time and how the global interest rate has declined over time as well. You also touch upon how the US is actually really privileged from a financial standpoint. Following this, you look at a model for how current account imbalances are actually determined due to varying patience and expectations of output. You then look at potential issues with sovereign finance and why debt crises emerge. You also look at how these can be avoided by using bailouts, backstops, and debt forgiveness. Taking a slightly different turn, You then look at the role of money in the financial system and the role that financial intermediaries have played over the last 50 years or so. You also look at how these intermediaries can actually exacerbate the economic cycle. To finish off the term, you look at monetary union and why the European Union has a lot of flaws for a monetary union. Overall, I really did not like this section of macro, given that the rest of it was really good. The lecture notes often had way too much writing on them, and it was often really difficult to know what you did need to know and just did not need to know at all. In addition, the lecture was really difficult to stay engaged with. I knew pretty early on that I was not going to answer this lecture's content in the exam. However, maybe all of this was just down to personal preference, because I know that my girlfriend was actually really happy to have some economics lecture notes that weren't purely just maths. And now I'm going to talk about my first optional paper. This is Advanced Econometrics. I have to say that this was probably the paper I found the hardest out of my whole time at Cambridge. The paper is split into macroeconometrics in the first term and microeconometrics in the second term. Macroeconometrics first recaps ARMA models and then looks at the Box-Jenkins methodology, which is how you can break down a time series into a trend, cycle, and seasonal component. You then revisit random walk processes and how to test whether you have a unit root. For the rest of this paper, all of the econometrics is then done using matrices, which just made the whole thing a lot harder. This was such a massive jump. So first, you look at how to actually represent a regression in a matrix format. You then look at how to derive efficient estimators when your error term is also correlated or your regression has heteroscedasticity. You then look at how potentially unrelated regressions can actually be used in tandem to increase efficiency. Following this, you look at how to use instrumental variables when your regression is all in matrices. To finish off the term, you look at multivariate models and how to deal with the issue when your independent variables are non-stationary. All of this stuff is probably going to sound super complicated to someone who's never done any econometrics. I don't think I've actually ever found anything more baffling than learning this stuff right now. The lecturer was quite funny and he did explain some stuff well. However, he did really have a tendency to skip over the quite key, more basic stuff and focus on harder stuff that just really wasn't very relevant. The second term was easier, but definitely still very difficult in comparison to the other papers. Again, it was all done using matrices. First, you look at the difference in difference estimator again and analyze when it's good to use it and when it's not so good to use it. You then look at other panel data models, such as pooled OLS and fixed effect models. Following this, you look at binomial choice models, such as the probit and logit model, which you learn in second year. You then extend this so that you have more than two choices. This is done by using a mixed logit model. Lastly, you look at how to evaluate the effects of a policy and get a brief introduction to machine learning and look at things like decision trees. Overall, the content of this term was still very hard. The lecturer was quite decent and he was a lot better than he was in first year. And lastly, onto my second optional paper, which was banking and finance. This paper was probably the only proper look into finance in the whole of the Cambridge Economics course. And it doesn't really focus on content that is relevant to a career in finance. This paper is split into 4 sections, like micro and macro. The first section is taught by the same lecturer who teaches the first section of macro. The first section is on credit and development and essentially looks at how credit constraints hinder development in less economically developed countries. You look at moral hazard and adverse selection models for why these credit constraints actually emerge. You also look at a model for how inequality and persistence in unskilled labour can arise. This section also looks at a few empirical papers which analyses how effective these models actually are. Overall, this section was actually pretty good, although the lecturer wasn't the best at times. The content had a great balance between maths, intuition, and empirical studies. The second section of the term was on asset pricing. This paper is the main paper that has any relevant link to finance, but it's also super theoretical. You first look at historical returns in some financial markets and how to actually define return and variance. You then look at portfolio theory, which is essentially how to allocate your assets between different types, given that there's always going to be some sort of risk-reward trade-off. Following this, you derive the capital asset pricing model, which is actually a really fundamental building block in finance. You then derive arbitrage pricing theory and how this actually differs from the capital asset pricing model. To close off, you look at the empirical evaluation of the capital asset pricing model and the arbitrage pricing theory. Overall, I did think that this section was quite interesting and it was good to get some sort of content that was relevant to a career in finance. However, because you only scratch the surface, it was often too theoretical and it's actually hard to see how this would be useful in practice. The content was interesting and you could always ask a question mid-lecture, which was sometimes helpful. The first section of second term was on corporate finance. This also definitely has some links to a career in finance. You first look at capital structure and why equity and debt have different pros and cons as a method of finance. This was done theoretically with many assumptions that are unrealistic, such as perfect information, no taxes, and stuff like that. Following this, you incorporate taxes into the model and how you can get an interest tax shield. You also look at how different types of taxes have different effects. Following this, you look at agency theories. These theories look at how incentives can often be misaligned between management and shareholders, because when a company is likely to default, the managers don't really have much incentive to keep going and save it. Lastly, you look at payout policy and how share repurchases and dividends are essentially equal in a perfect economic world. Overall, I thought that the content wasn't massively interesting, but it was lectured quite well. Finally, to close off banking and finance, the final section is on credit and banking. First, you recap what a bank actually does and what the typical balance sheet of a bank looks like. You then derive the result of the Arrow-Debreu model, which states that money, banks, and capital structure are all irrelevant in a perfect economic world. Following this, you incorporate various frictions to then show how the result would differ. You then derive a model which essentially argues why there is a financial accelerator effect when credit conditions change. To finish off this section, you look at a model for bank runs and the ways in which they can be prevented. Overall, I thought that the mathematical content in this section was quite interesting, but it did all get a bit repetitive after a while. In addition, I think it wasn't lectured particularly well and wasn't very engaging. And now I'm going to talk about the optional papers that you can take besides the ones I've mentioned here. So these are all of the other optional papers that you can take. I think the econometrics and banking papers were quite popular along with industry and development. Students who want to go on to do some postgraduate economics were also encouraged to take economic theory and analysis. There are also some history and politics based papers such as world depression in the interwar years and political economics. You also can borrow papers from other faculties such as the sociology faculty and the psychology faculty. However, these do kind of vary year on year. So that's my summary of all of the papers in third year. I'll now go over the exams and how COVID affected the end of the year. The effects of COVID weren't really felt in Cambridge until the middle of March. This was when, in normal circumstances, everyone would be going home at the end of the second term. However, after we returned home, it became pretty clear that we weren't coming back. Usually, we would have a 3-hour exam for each of the papers in May and June. Instead, they removed all of the optional paper exams and we only were examined on micro and macro. These exams were to be completed within a 24-hour window, although they did recommend that you should only spend about 3 hours on that, but they definitely did not police it. The style of the questions changed dramatically because they were all taken online. In addition, they implemented a safety net, which meant that you couldn't do any worse than your grade in second year. I thought this was really generous, especially in comparison to what some other universities did. Instead of each paper accounting for 20% along with the dissertation, the COVID exam structure was such that the micro and macro papers were worth 17.5% each, and then the dissertation was now worth 65%. Its deadline was also extended from the middle of April to the end of May. This took a lot of stress off because most people were already quite close to finishing the dissertation by the end of March. In addition, the safety net took a lot of pressure off because you couldn't do any worse than you could the year before. As a result, I barely spent any time revising for micro and macro because I thought the exams weren't really worth a lot and I'd rather just focus on my dissertation. Given everything that was going on, I was really happy with how the university dealt with it because it gave all of the students a lot less stress. Now, going on to the workload. I definitely feel like my workload throughout the whole of third year was a lot less to the 2 years before. I had a lot more time just to hang out with friends, to do lots of gymnastics, and just to do fun stuff, really. I believe this is because they wanted to give you a good amount of time to do your dissertation. If a paper had 4 sections, such as micro, macro, and banking, then there were 2 supervisions per section. This essentially meant that there were 4 supervisions per term. If a paper had 2 sections, such as the econometrics papers, then there were 4 supervisions per section. First year, first section micro supervision worksheets were very odd and different, so took around 4 to 5 hours to complete. The second section of first term micro was fairly standard, and those supervision worksheets only took 2 to 3 hours to complete. Second term first section micro often took a bit longer because the questions were confusing and not written very well. So they usually took around 4 hours to complete. For the final section of micro, because I knew I wasn't going to actually do the content in the exam, I didn't even do the second supervision. However, the first supervision did take quite a while and took around 4 to 5 hours. And now for macro. The first term, first section supervision worksheets took around 3 to 4 hours to complete. The second section, first term macro supervisions were also quite easy to complete and took around 2 to 3 hours. Second term, first section macro supervision worksheets were a bit harder and took around 4 to 5 hours to complete, while the second section of second term supervisions were often really long and written really badly and took around 5 hours to complete. Advanced econometric supervisions were often really tough for me. Sometimes I'd spend about up to 6 hours doing a supervision, and if I still couldn't get all the answers, then I would just give up and move it on. This was also similar for the second section of advanced econometrics. Lastly, all of the banking and finance supervisions took around 2 to 3 hours to complete. I was doing my dissertation in the background of this, but in term, I only spent about 1 to 2 hours a week doing it. So there you have it. This is my honest opinion on the final year of Cambridge undergraduate economics. Thank you so much for following this series on my channel, and my next video will be on how to write a dissertation when you really don't want to, which is basically the situation I was in. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to put something down in the comments or send me an email. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.